President. I thank you, Senator Rubio, for your comments. So whenever I hear my colleagues rail against China, and I agree with that 95% of the time, whenever I hear them say things like we want the world's, that they want to be the world's most powerful country, the most powerful government, I agree with that. But let's, as Senator Rubio said, this isn't a debate between him and me. I just want to make a couple of comments. I want to talk about worker safety in a moment that I know the presiding officer cares so much about. I go back a half a generation, and Senator Rubio wasn't here then, but many of his ideological soulmates were here then. And this Congress couldn't stop itself from Presidents Clinton and Bush 1 and Obama and Bush 2 and Trump couldn't help themselves from giving all kinds of breaks to American corporations, incentives to American corporations to go to China, to move to China. So they shut down production in Duluth, Minnesota. They shut down production in Mansfield, Ohio, my hometown, or Toledo and Youngstown, as corporations were lobbying Congress. I teamed up with Lindsey Graham, a Republican, against that. We were unsuccessful. His corporations lobbied Congress to give China something called permanent normal trade relations. So they shut down production in Ohio. They moved that production to China. And what happened? They taught China a whole lot about manufacturing, and they created a whole lot of wealth in China. And now we're surprised about TikTok. We're surprised that the Chinese military is as powerful as it is. I just think it's important that we remember when we listen to corporate interests in this body who lobby here to weaken, to push jobs overseas, these are the kinds of things that happen. And I hope we learn from that, and I hope we take that lesson and apply it to TikTok and into the future. So, Senator Rubio, thank you for raising the issue. Madam President, I want to talk about worker safety for a moment. On Friday, 7 American workers went to work in West Reading, Pennsylvania at the RM Chocolate Factory to provide for their families. I spoke to Senator Casey about this, who's one of the leaders, represents the senior senator from Pennsylvania, who's one of the leaders in fighting for worker safety in this body. I spoke with him about it a few minutes ago. Those 7 workers never came home after an explosion leveled the plant. Our thoughts are with their families who lost sons and daughters, workers who were paid decent wages, not exorbitant wages, decent wages, and never return home to their families. We'll learn more about what went wrong. I know that Pennsylvania workers will always have an ally in Senators Casey and Fetterman on this issue and so much more. This struck me in a more emphatic way because it was I believe it was one day before the 112th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. That tragedy woke up the nation to the dangers that workers faced in the jobs. Dozens of workers, because the management had locked the factory doors because they were afraid some of these very low-paid, mostly women, some of them very young workers, might steal a blouse or two. They locked the factory doors. So when this fire broke out in a very flammable environment, workers jumped out the window to their deaths, dozens and dozens of workers. That made a huge difference in Congress finally dealing with worker safety. In fact, a woman who was nearby, heard the sirens, came to the scene, was named Frances Perkins. This was in 1911. She became the first female Secretary of Labor under President Roosevelt, stayed with him his entire 12-plus years in office, played a big role with Senator Wagner of writing the most pro-worker legislation in the nation's history, especially on worker safety. Now, Madam President, I wear this pin on my lapel. I've worn it since it was given to me 25 years ago at a Workers' Memorial Day rally by the steelworkers. It's a depiction of a canary in a birdcage. The mine workers, 120 years ago, used to take a canary down in the mine. If the canary died from toxic gas or lack of oxygen, the mine worker got out of the mines. He had no union in those days strong enough to protect him. He had no government in those days that cared enough to protect him. We changed that because of worker safety laws. We changed that because of unions. This tragedy in West Reading, Pennsylvania, reminds us that our work to protect workers and make workplaces safer never ends. I think about the steel workers who lost their lives near Toledo in an explosion in a refinery in Oregon, Ohio last year. Max Morrissey and Ben Morrissey, they were brothers, died in that accident. I think about the Norfolk Southern worker Norfolk Southern because of its culture of laying off workers and compromising safety and paying big compensation bonuses to executives. A worker at Norfolk Southern lost his life earlier this month. No worker should have to work about returning, kissing her husband goodbye, kiss his wife goodbye, kiss his children or her children goodbye. Shouldn't have to worry about returning home. That's why we should stand up to corporate lobbies who always want to cut costs, worker safety. Be damned. We know what happened. We saw in East Palestine what happened because the railroad laid off a third of its workers, and then they compromised on safety. We saw what happened in Silicon Valley Bank when they didn't pay attention to consumers and regulators and the public interest. And again, workers always pay the price. We know what will happen. Every time there's an industrial accident, people are upset, they worry about it, but the companies continue to lobby regulators for weaker laws. We see it here with corporate lobbyists. We see it in the regulatory agencies when they always want to weaken consumer laws. They always want to weaken environmental laws. They always want to weaken worker safety laws. And communities always pay, and workers always pay. It's why a union card is so powerful. It means higher wages, it means better benefits, it means safer workplace. If you love this country, you fight for the people who make it work, whether they punch a clock or swipe a badge, whether they work at tips, whether they work for tips, or whether they work on salary. You fight to keep people safe in the job. That is our job here to make sure we do that better than we have in the past. Madam President, I